Hello, I'm Bruce.
Hi, I'm Aditya.
We are the Risky Scientists, and we have a special guest this week, Bill Marcelino. So, Bill, we're going to talk about robust decision making, which is within your expertise, and I'm very grateful that you are here. I'm grateful to have an expert, a genuine expert on this to explain what it is and how the public can learn from you. So I think we should start with your introduction. So maybe I could impose on you to introduce yourself, how you got to the position you're at Rand, which you, I know Rand. I used to, just full disclosure, I used to work at Rand myself. I didn't know you back then. I precede you at Rand. So can you just explain how you got to Rand and how you got to robust decision making?
So I'm a former U.S. Marine, and I think that's how we met, Bruce. Is you had I and my colleague J.D. Williams at Rand on to talk about the Marine Corps decision to divest of tanks, which, by the way, is a great example of decision making, and we may bring up actually when we talk about this. But so left the Marine Corps. I had a time in private business as a business owner, which I found unsatisfying. It didn't sort of scratch the same kinds of service itches and meaning-making itches that I got in the Marine Corps. So I ended up selling my business. I got a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in, of all things, rhetoric, which is kind of weird. But CMU, being an engineering school, my rhetoric program, although it was housed in the English department, featured corpus linguists. It featured sociolinguists that did a lot of empirical social science work, theoretical linguists like Paul Hopper. So I ended up moving away from the humanities in my PhD to become a corpus linguist who uses computers to look at very large data sets of language data, and then also sort of micro level quantitative stuff. So it's kind of in both worlds. And did some work with the Marine Corps on resilience, personal resilience, and interventions for that. And then Rand hired me. And at Rand, my job really, and my specialty at Rand is I'm a senior behavioral scientist. What I am trying to do in my work is bring scalable analytics to bear on behavioral problems that require analysis of large volumes of either unstructured or semi-structured data. So that often looks like, for example, social media data, where there may be some structure involved with it, like metadata, things like mentions, time of day, the account name, but also a lot of unstructured data. People saying things like, F you, pal, what do you do with that, or that kind of thing. And so I would not say that I'm an expert in robust decision making. There are other people at Rand who are much more capable than I am. What I do hope I can do is give you, I think I am good at explaining these complex methods because I'm a methods instructor. I teach at Johns Hopkins University and I teach at Rand, and I teach method courses. So trying to explain methods is something that I think I do have a core capability in, and I hope I can help explain robust decision making. Does that follow?
Yeah, well, fantastic. We've got a lot of crossover here, and there's potential for us to talk about all sorts of things. So this is going to be exciting. So I'm very pleased, and I'm very keen to get on with this. So I suppose my first question is, what are the typical problems with policy making that we need to address with a solution? Let's call it a solution like robust decision making.
So it's a good question. And one of the really big problems, one of the core problems that decision makers face is how do you make good decisions under conditions of uncertainty, right? There may be some things that we have a lot of confidence about what's going to happen, but we often don't have a lot of certainty. And really uncertainty comes in two main flavors for policymakers. One of them is uncertainty about the future. Right? Like the longer you go out, the farther you go out in the future, the more cloudy the future is, right? There's more possible permutations, things could happen differently. So, projecting out farther and farther and farther, which you have to do sometimes. Sometimes to mitigate faraway futures, you have to act now. So that's an inherent kind of uncertainty. The other one is, how will our interventions impact things? What policies work best? How do they combine? How effective will they be? So that's also another kind of uncertainty. So we often have to recognize that we are under conditions of deep uncertainty for many problems like climate change, flood management, insurance, about risk, policies about avoiding national security risks. There are many spaces, policy spaces, where there is significant uncertainty and we want to make good decisions. One of the difficulties is that we have tended to rely on, so there's two methods. One method is scenario development. One of the things you can do is you can develop many plausible scenarios, which is very often more like a qualitative exercise where I kind of think, well, what are some possible futures? And they have a real strength. And the strength of those is that they tend to help us, or they can help us overcome our biases. By presenting us with a range of possible futures, maybe ones that a decision maker hadn't thought about, that can really help push back against biases that we don't really understand that we had, right? But that also tends to not use data as much, right? It's a less quantitative, predictive, modeling and data kind of approach. A more common, I think, the much more dominant model in decision making, at least in the West and for the US, has been predictive analytics, predictive modeling kind of approaches, where we have data. Based on data, we do sort of probabilistic work to figure out what's going to happen. And we call that predict then act, right? So I think looking at the future, this is what's going to happen. And then based on that, you sort of optimize for it. And I'm going to use some historical national security examples because I'm still a Marine and, you're a tank guy. And I'm sure Aditya, you would be interested in this as well.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. So you should, by all means.
Okay. So World War II. We're doing well. We're pushing towards Germany. Things are going great. And you're thinking there may be a risk of a counteroffensive, but the one thing you're pretty confident is that it won't be through the Ardennes forests, right? I mean, it's too dense. It's a bad place for tanks. Like, it makes no sense at all. So when you plan for what's going to happen, you don't plan for something like a counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Turns out that was a pretty brittle choice, right? In hindsight, not only did it turn out that that was the case, it may have been true that you were wrong about your probabilities, right? You may have actually not fully accounted for what was probable. Another example, you're looking at, say, Imperial Japan, and you're thinking about, what could they do? And you're pretty sure there's going to be some kind of conflict. And so you look at it, you're like, well, they may go over here into Indochine. They could do this in the Pacific. We got to think about Australia. But the chances of them attacking, say, the U.S., us actually, our nation, pretty low. So why bother with that? Well, turns out actually that could be a catastrophic failure. And in the first example, the Battle of the Bulge example, it didn't end up being catastrophic. But I would say, not understanding the risks of Japanese attack on the homeland and Pearl Harbor, that was genuinely catastrophic. That could have really tipped the scales, in that theater. So what we want to avoid then is guessing wrong catastrophically. And that is a real problem in policymaking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of what you're saying, I think, sounds a lot like risk management. So you're listing contingencies and you want to put probabilities on what might happen in the future. And you're going to care about contingencies also by their potential outcomes. So if you assess this contingency as more destructive than the other contingencies, then you're going to worry about that as a risk more than the other contingencies, depending on the risk computation between the probability and the outcome. So so my first question is easy question to follow up here is, what's stopping policymakers from just being risk managers?
So that is a good question. And one issue is that risk management historically has been about optimizing. So historically, when we look at decision making, it's been a lot less about what are either catastrophic outcomes, it's been what are our most likely futures. And so there's been this sort of instinct, or I shouldn't say instinct. There's been a historical tendency to try and optimize for futures. And, our Marine Corps tank discussion was part of that, right? Yeah. Like, I think we're headed towards great power competition with China, and long-range precision fires are the biggest threat. And I'm less concerned about, say, some small or medium intensity conflict in Africa where I need tanks. So I optimize for that. Well, if you guess right, that's great. If you guess wrong, it could be really bad. And it could be really bad locally. You know, maybe bad, say, you know, strategically for the whole nation, but say for a force that gets, you know, doesn't work out very well, you know, in a battle, that's catastrophic for them. So that's part of it. Is the tendency has been to look at this sort of future, right? The other thing is that when you do that, there's a real problem with getting hung up on dueling futures, and to start thinking about investing your arguments in the correctness of your future versus the adequacy of your proposed interventions. And I'm going to give you an example. So Aditya, you're looking at data. You're really convinced that climate change is the most pressing problem we're facing in the future. And not only that, it's most pressing because it's going to be catastrophic. You've done your modeling, and you're really convinced that the evidence is very clear. We are heading for catastrophic outcomes from this. And so you want to optimize for that future. You want policies that are going to be high cost, maybe have second and third order effects in other areas, and really close off other options. But you're convinced of it because you are so convinced that your future is the correct future, right? But Bruce has a different perspective. Bruce has looked at the data also, and he has different evidence he's pulled out of it and different inferences and conclusions, and he's really worried about energy security. Bruce is like, look, we're heading for a world with less and less oil, more and more dependency on outside oil futures. The real risk is not so much climate change, it's that we're going to end up energy starved. And the real kicker here is that the policies that Aditya wants to follow are just the ones that you want to avoid, right? The climate change mitigation strategies he wants to advocate for actually make your future worse. And so you end up having this big food fight or a duel over futures and the investment. And you can see this all the time. Like, look on Facebook, your friends arguing over things. They are very rarely arguing over risk management or how to be robustly safe, right? They're like, the world's going this way and I know, usually because I have ideological commitments and I like Fox News or I like the New York Times, and therefore I'm narrating a future that really dovetails with my identity, helps present me as being someone who of this tribe or group. And so we have these food fights. And here's where RDM comes in. And we can explain more detail, but imagine this. What if we started asking not whose future is more likely, but rather, are there interventions that can cover both futures? So I'll throw one out there. Imagine this. Imagine we propose an intervention where we're going to invest in solar power and really developing robust solar capacity. We've looked at the possibilities, and we see it's really credible that we can start really making a shift both in emissions, but also in consumption of oil if we make this national investment in alternative energy sources. And suddenly, both of you are happy, right? Aditya's happy because that intervention reduces emissions and it helps make his future look better. And then Bruce is happy because I'm not depending on, you know, like foreign oil sources and that kind of stuff. And I'm covered because I may be worried about oil running out. I'm not worried about the sun running out. And so that's the entry point, is this idea of thinking about what are options and strategies that cover multiple futures.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple of things to talk about there. So risk management fails, pure computations at risk fail as a guide to decision making when our disputes are certainly about values. So if we value different things, we can't use risk to come to a resolution. And if we're arguing about evidence, so if we draw different evidence from the same data, we can compute risk differently. So there are two problems there. And then, and that's actually very pertinent to the dispute about alternative energy. So we've just had Michael Moore, for instance, put out a movie which is very critical of the myths that are being peddled by advocates of alternative energy. So alternative energy, a lot of alternative energy doesn't turn out to be that alternative. So you still, like you say, you're burning renewable trees. You're still building. You're still burning organic material and producing the same pollutants, and the trees are being burn faster than you can renew them. So there's a lot of myths about this, and then you can talk about solar energy is not yet efficient enough to replace the fossil fuels and provide the same level of energy output that we need. So we can end up in disputes then about futures again. So now you have to make probabilities you have to estimate probabilities. Mm-hmm. Well, when would solar energy really replace fossil fuels, let's say? When could we get to a stage where we're renewing enough forests at the rate we're burning forests? So how could we escape this? We might talk about it as a vicious cycle, where we're now trying to resolve a dispute between this hypothetical Aditya and hypothetical Bruce about whether we should value pollutants versus energy security. If we find a solution that sort of meets both of our needs or our values, we still return to this vicious cycle where now we've still got a dispute about the futures, right? So how do we escape that vicious cycle?
So and again, uncertainty includes the efficacy of possible solutions. And by the way, the example I gave you was notional. I don't have any evidence that solar energy is a silver bullet. It's meant to illustrate the point.
Yeah, but I realize, yeah.
But you're raising a good point, right? Which is that we'll still have to all evaluate these possible solutions. So robust decision making has several stages, and essentially what this is about is you use scenario development to look at many possible futures, and then you use databases to generate multiple models based on those possible futures. So you end up with case after case after case after case. And this could be many thousands and thousands of cases that correspond to different futures and different possible solutions. And then to look for, what are the ones that most robustly cover the most futures and offer the best trade-off. So the first thing is this idea of case generation. And that is running a model, over and over and over again to generate this wide range of possibilities. And I wanted to maybe mention something real quick because our audience may or may not be super familiar with modeling, but I think that most people in the public are familiar with modeling from a predictive standpoint. Mm-hmm. They're mostly thinking that the purpose of modeling is to tell you what's going to happen in the future. And I think we saw this in the early parts of COVID when people would over and over again reference a given model, and they would really emphasize the number of casualties in the model. And what they really focused on was, oh my gosh, this model says, 2 million people are going to die, or X million, or whatever the number is, right? And so the emphasis for the ordinary person is the purpose of this model was to make a robust decision about how many folks are going to die, which, by the way, sets us up for a lot of post hoc criticism when those numbers don't get reached. But another purpose of modeling, and one that's much more appropriate, and there are cases, there are parts of the world where our models and our data are so good, we can do a pretty good job actually predicting things, like modeling the spread of wildfires. We have a lot of data on how wildfires work, and we do a pretty good job modeling how they move. And they're really useful in that sense. But especially, for example, in the early stages of a pandemic, right, where we don't know a lot of things, our data is incomplete, and a lot of it may be wrong, actually. The value of modeling may not be in prediction, but rather in parameter space exploration, right? And I see you modeling, you must be aware of this, right? The idea that I'm not trying to predict the number of people that's going to die. It's I want to try and prune my decision tree to get towards the low end, whatever that number is. Is that something, by the way, that you all saw or felt as well during this period?
Absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that because I've been meaning to say that what you're describing as robust decision-making sounds at some level almost like a solution to the explore-exploit trade-off because it sounds like when you're thinking about scenario planning, at least from what I know talking to Peter Schwartz, it often seems like the big problem is, like you mentioned, you get too attached to a future and then you're trying to say, I'm going to try and prove this future because there's some potential here, which feels like an early exploitation without very much evidence at all. And we did do an episode on modeling a few weeks ago, and it's absolutely, I'm with you that it seems like predictive models are very useful in only a rare case. And I think today, for example, I have a fairly high degree of trust in NASA's models of whether or not the rocket will reach the ISS. So you can think of that as a very high level of model. But I'm curious, do you think of this at all in terms of the exploit trade-off? At least from my senses, quantitative data, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with that term of art, but I think I understand the idea. And it, again, is to avoid being wedded to a future and then making decisions that go along with what you've justified a priori and decided upon. So the first step in an RDM is this idea of generating many, many cases. So now we end up with, thousands of plots, right? And each plot, each point represents a case. They're all notional. They are possible futures. So we're thinking about, water security. A state wants to make sure they have water going forward. And so we think about, is there going to be more rain or less rain going forward? Will we have more or less infrastructure? Will populations increase or decrease so the demand changes, right? And as you tinker with those parameters, the number of possible cases, future cases, expands enormously. So we end up with this enormous range of cases. And then we want to go ahead and start running those cases against the potential implementation plans. What can we do against them, right? So now we're going to discover these scenarios, right? How do they stack up against them? And that, by the way, may show us that, like, hey, we're wildly unprepared. We have to go back to the drawing board and start thinking about novel solutions and do this over again. Or we might start thinking, okay, yeah, at some point now in these iterations, we've got, a good sense of, sort of current infrastructure capability policies, possible interventions. And now we can do a thing called decision structuring, right? Where we're based on the actual vulnerabilities you've decided, you can start thinking about how we can mitigate risk. And that finally is up to what I think is probably the most important part. And Bruce, what I think you might like is this idea of trade-off analysis, right? I want to think about the trade-offs. And I am going to take a leap here. I hope my friends at RAND don't get mad at me, but I think of this portion as very much like ensemble methods in machine learning. And what I mean by that is that when I want to classify something, and by the way, and I think this is actually another, so there's two ways in which I think this idea of trade-offs, looking at all the possible trade-offs and visualizing them, right? These futures against possible interventions is when I do classifying, I want to do simple algorithms first before I even think about a deep algorithm. And the reason I think I see you're nodding right there. The reason is that, while deep methods have some great advantages, they're much more powerful. They take advantage of large data sets. Those are all great things. And we use them. Every time I Google like cute rabbit pictures on Google, every time, as we move into autonomous driving, deep models are incredibly important and powerful and give us great benefits. They solve many problems. But one thing they do also do is they give you black box solutions. You can't ask them how they got there. So number one, if I really want to evaluate what's going on, understand it, I probably have to have as an intermediate step something where I can ask it, hey, how'd you get there to your decisions? So I might use a random forest classifier where I am saying I'm going to introduce randomness in two ways. One is different data splits. So I don't have to worry about you optimizing to one future or one part of the data. And secondly, give you different feature sets. And now I wind up with many, many, many decision trees. And then we vote on them, right? So the art of a random forest is I can vote on them and say, as an ensemble, who does the most goodest? And that's the one I want to choose. Kind of like looking at many, many, many possible intervention strategies. And I ask, which one covers the most ground? Which one gives us the most optimal coverage for possible futures at a, say, a given price or investment. The second part, though, is that I can actually ask then about specific, feature sets. So I might ask my random classifier, hey, what are the features that Russian trolls use linguistically that helps me identify them the best, so I can I can do some feature engineering and improve my model. But I can also ask, hey, when I think about risk for water scarcity, it turns out actually the most critical vulnerabilities are rainfall, demographic growth or retreat, and maybe like the stability, whether or not my plans are dynamic or whether they're static for responding. And now that really helps me trying to think about what are the most robust interventions. And then I'm going to guess, Aditya, you're familiar with the idea of decision boundaries and visualizing a decision boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take a risk here trying to describe something that's visual with words. Hopefully it makes sense.
We'll try and put a picture up.
Maybe we can. So if you could put a picture up of a decision boundary for a classifier, but like a common problem would be, hey, like spam or not spam.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to model, is this spam or not spam? Like, if it involves Nigerian princes and lotteries, if it involves Viagra and performance, I kind of want it to go over into this pile. And if it's like, hey, Bill, you didn't answer my last email, I want in that pile, right? And so ordinarily in machine learning, we have many, many dimensions to our problem. So it's hard to visualize them for human beings, right? But let's imagine we have a very simple problem. Like I want to good investment, bad investment in houses. So I'm going to have features like the number of rooms, and that's my y-axis, and the cost of the property. And I'm going to chart things out, and hopefully what it gets clusters.
Yeah.
Like one cluster is like, oh, these are all the bad investments. These are good ones. I can draw a pretty good straight line and do that. I can do the same thing in robust decision making. At the end of that process, what I can see is based on, say, for example, like the cost of an intervention versus like downstream costs, I could draw a line and go, wow, I'm covering like 12% of the futures. Remember, all those dots are cases. And on my graph now, I'm covering a negligible or a very small amount. That's brittle. But if I start tinkering with things, oh my gosh, now I have a huge number of cases under the curve, so to speak, within that decision boundary line. And I started feeling really good now about my possible choices. The other thing, and I'm going to turn this over again to you all in a second, is we don't live in a technocratic world where people like us make decisions. And which is a good thing, by the way, because the world would be a hell if we were in charge of it. Rather, we have to give really good options and good advice to decision makers who are really skilled, actually. Hopefully they're skilled at something different than us. They're skilled at trade-offs. They're skilled at figuring out, well, because it's great to talk about, energy scarcity. There's also national defense. There's education. There's public opinion. There's a lot of things. There's values. There's human values and beliefs, what we ought to do or ought to do. So being able to visualize and communicate to a decision maker what their options look like in the end, it's really powerful.
It's fascinating that you bring up so many things to talk about. I want to go back a quick moment because we just did an episode on machine learning last week.
Oh,
and
cool.
What you said about random forests, I think, is a subtle point that I want to emphasize, in that you said you run your algorithm, but then you have to go back and look at what your markers are, right? You have to look at the features. And from my experience, almost everyone in a data science class realizes that either they feed it through Google's Inception or they feed it through a random forest network. And this is it, because you get amazing accuracy and you get these amazing results. But that's where I think a lot of people stop, that where, if I understand what you're saying correctly, where most data science students stop is where the decision-making actually begins. In that you can't stop and rest on the laurels of your random forest. You have to understand, why is the random forest trying to group these things? Or why is the decision boundary the shape? If you see a decision boundary that's quadratic, maybe one thing is growing faster than the other. And so those are the questions, if I understand what you're saying, that you are now trying to package somehow and then pass off to decision makers.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. We have a forthcoming paper be out very soon we did a great, really cool, and one of the things being at RAND is like you get to do all this like wacky, crazy stuff. Like I'm all over the map. It's amazing. The UK Ministry of Defense, so kind of like the DoD for the United Kingdom, UK MOD, they have a thing called DSTL, Defense Science Technology Lab, kind of like a baby DARPA. It just goes down one digit too, in numbers. And DSTL asked us to build a machine learning model to identify Russian trolls acting on the internet, posing. So these are not bots, not machines. These are people who are they work for the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, and their job is to go in and pretend to be other people and cause problems, sow dissent, undermine democracy, get folks stirred up. And so one of the really important outcomes was not just the accuracy of the classifier. So our random forest classifier, when it was a binary problem, looking at you're a troll versus not a troll, ended up with some pretty high accuracy, 90%. That's really good accuracy for a shallow model. And this is only using linguistic style. So we were actually content agnostic. It's not talking about so-and-so or this person or that person. It's how angry, how much intensifiers you're using, the amount of certainty language or uncertainty. So pretty cool stuff. But much more important, not just resting on the laurels of the accuracy and the precision of the model, was understanding that the most important features for identifying a Russian troll was the use of immediacy language, the use of intensifier language, the use of negative language, and the use of social closest distance language, us and them. What it looked like in practice, when you then use those features and look for examples, you're arguing, if you are pretending to be a progressive, you argue about the urgency of how oppressive America is racially and the threat posed to people about racist policies in the U.S. We have to act right now. But if you're pretending to be a conservative, it's about the threat of immigration and Sharia law and Islam. So we have to act right now to head off these problems from them. What an amazing insight to then possibly help responses. How would we maybe make our publics more resistant and resilient, this kind of stuff? But I can't get there if I don't understand why these things work the way they work. And the same thing happens in RDM. We identify the most important features for why we are vulnerable.
So much in there that we could talk about. There's so many crossovers with our recent episode on machine learning. I'm actually thinking, Bill, we should do episode 2 of machine learning and have you in it to go even more advanced. This is fascinating. So I'm going to let Aditya think some more about the machine learning part of what you're saying. And I'm just going to pose as the risk scientist here and go back to modeling. So I'm going to describe a systemic problem from the risk scientist perspective of modeling, which is modeling is really good at predicting what's going to happen if an event happens, right? So if you mentioned the example of a wildfire. So if a wildfire spreads through this valley, we're really good at predicting how it's going to behave, like what direction it's going to take under these climatic weather conditions. And then if it hits this property, this real estate, these would be the costs, right? That part is really easy to predict, and that's really good for your risk mitigation, your preparedness, your response part of the risk management process. But modeling's not good. I'm actually thinking what part of the process I'm pointing at here. But the modeling is not so good at predicting if the event happens.
I think that is the core issue right here. And, hopefully I can give you a link to a RAND report. The idea is that we have a concern about water security going forward. So we have a river basin, we have a municipal authority that's in charge of this river basin, and we have to make choices, right? We want to make sure that we have water available, in 50 years, right? You don't want to find in 50 years that water scarcity is just catastrophically harming the state, economically, quality of life, a lot of ways, right? And there could be all these downstream issues. So this is really critical. And the problem you've just identified is the core problem. Because if there's more average rainfall going forward, that really shapes what you have to do. Mm-hmm. But if rainfall goes down declines over time, that also really, changes what's going to happen. And population density, not just increase or decrease, right? But the distribution of population can have some big impacts, right? Because if it grows in some areas versus others, it can have diverse impacts. And so what you can think about is that there are a whole range of what I would call features, from my world sort of, but we might think of as like, factors, right? These different factors that affect our future. We don't know what's going to happen. And what's really hard, what can really bake your noodle is what happens if they vary differently, right? So it's like in this future, these 3 things go wrong, these 2 go up, this one stays neutral. And, so how do you plan for that? And that's what the idea of case generation and making all these possible futures is. We don't know if rainfall will increase or decrease. We don't know if we're going to have more or less population. We don't know if there'll be new technologies that help with water reclamation. There are so many things that we are not sure of. But if we do modeling where we tune the parameters to produce a range of possibilities that reflect what is plausible. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we don't do this with implausible futures. Like we don't think that rain is going to increase by 25%, right? But we do think 3% either way is a plausible parameter to put in. We don't think that like the population is going to treble, in the next 50 years, but we put in plausible ones. And then by generating these many, many possible futures, that's where we don't have to worry so much now about what is the real future. It's what are scenarios that will cover the most. But the other important thing too, by the way, is it's not just optimizing for the most coverage, because different interventions and different mitigation plans have different costs, and they're never made in a vacuum. So again, we can often produce visualizations. So imagine a visualization where there's like a bar for how much something costs to implement, where we're ranked by how much future they cover. And now I can kind of like look for a sweet spot. Mm-hmm. You know how we're often looking for like an elbow curve in things, right? Like I want to optimize the number of topics in a topic model. I want to try and figure out, I'll tell you one, a common problem for me is when I want to bring, and by the way, we talk about machine learning. I'm actually a human machine guy. My focus and concentration is actually not on when I want to use machine learning, it's to then be leveraged by human understanding, because I love machines. Machines can do great things. They're really fast. They can work much better than me. They're much more reliable. By the time I've graded my 4th paper, like my brain's everywhere, that kind of stuff, right? So I love how machines can do distant work, see patterns in data at scale. They can see forest patterns I'll never see, because I'm looking at like a tree maybe or 2 trees, but we have high context. Think of all the knowledge, Bruce, that you have about tanks, about armor historically. My God, any problem that if you brought your high context knowledge to bear on something like that, it's just massive how much you know about the subject. But you're also like reading very slowly. You are unreliable sometimes. You have biases. So I love the marriage of these 2 things, right? So I really want to marry them together. Well, so I'm often looking to try and present, data and options or whatever in ways where human beings can make good decisions about it. And an example for me would be when I do social media analytics for EUCOM recently, we did a project for EUCOM where we try to detect Russian interference in real time. Or maybe we called it like enough time, right? Maybe not exactly real time, but close enough, right? Well, I'm going to bring limited human attention to bear on different communities in I have a big social media data set of French tweets about the World Cup. I'm trying to find bad guys in there, right? Or bad guy evidence, right? Well, I have one amazing French political scientist. I have Stephanie Pizarro, one of my colleagues. She's great. She's limited, though, in her ability. So I got to figure out how many communities I want to have a look at. And if I can look at community weight, so in a network analysis, the weight of communities, and I want to find the power distribution and go, oh, you know what, right here, it drops way off. I'm going to ignore the long tail. Here's where my juice, my squeeze is. Here's where the meat is.